The gravel crunched under my boots before I even reached the front porch. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the dark windows, not the truck parked at a crooked angle in the driveway like someone had stopped in a hurry. The gravel, the way it had been disturbed, scattered wide, the way it gets when someone moves fast and doesn't care about being quiet. I stood at the edge of the property for 3 seconds. Old habits. Then I walked toward the door. My son-in-law opened it before I knocked. He looked at me the way people look at something they didn't expect to see, mouth slightly open, color draining from his face, eyes doing that quick calculation that people do when the situation has suddenly shifted, and they're not sure which direction it shifted in. "Sir," he said. That was all he said. I nodded once and walked past him into the house. My daughter was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. She looked up when I came in. Her eyes were red. Not the kind of red that comes from crying, the kind that comes from holding it in for a long time. "I used the signal," she said quietly. "I didn't know if you'd—" "I know," I said. "I'm here." That was 45 minutes after I'd gotten her text. A single line. 7 words. Words she and I had agreed on years ago, sitting on the back porch of my house in Fayetteville the summer after her mother passed. A phrase that sounded ordinary to anyone else. A phrase that meant something specific and urgent to me. I had been sitting in a diner outside of Asheville, North Carolina, when my phone buzzed on the table. I remember I was eating a piece of pie I hadn't ordered. The waitress had brought it anyway, said I looked like a man who needed pie, and I hadn't argued. I read the message. I read it twice. Then I put 2 20s on the table, left the pie, and walked to my truck. I want to tell you about the drive, not because the drive matters, but because of what I thought about during it. I thought about my ex-wife. I thought about the last conversation we had where she used the word useless and whether she meant it the way it sounded or the way I chose to take it. I thought about my daughter at 8 years old asking me why I was always gone and me not having a good answer for her then, and me still not having a perfect one now. I thought about the 26 years I spent doing work that I can't fully describe to people at dinner parties, work that required me to be someone different depending on the room I was standing in, and whether any of that had prepared me for this specific moment, driving a 2-lane highway in the dark toward my daughter's house because something in her home had gone wrong enough that she'd sent the signal. I thought, I hope I'm not too late. I thought, I'm not going to be too late. There's a version of my life that looks very simple from the outside. I grew up in a small town in central Ohio. My father worked at a plant that made auto parts. My mother taught 3rd grade. I was an average student, decent at football, better at being quiet and watching things than most people realized. I enlisted at 18 because I didn't have a clearer plan and because something in me wanted to be tested, not in the way that reckless young men want to be tested, but in a quieter way. I wanted to know what I was made of when it mattered. The Army answered that question over the course of several decades in ways I did not always enjoy. I spent most of my career in military intelligence. Not the kind you see in movies, no high-speed chases, no dramatic monologues in interrogation rooms. Mostly it was patience. It was sitting with information longer than was comfortable. It was learning to read a room before you walked into it, to understand what people were not saying as clearly as what they were. It was a skill set that made me very good at my job and, according to my ex-wife, deeply frustrating to be married to. "You analyze everything," she told me once, early in our marriage. She meant it as a complaint. I took it as a compliment. That was probably part of the problem. We had been married for 11 years when she left. I was 51. My daughter was 23 and living in Charlotte by then. My ex-wife said she had spent over a decade feeling like she was living with a man who was physically present and emotionally somewhere else entirely. She wasn't wrong. I had tried to explain the nature of my work, the way it required a kind of compartmentalization that didn't switch off cleanly at the end of a deployment or a rotation. She had listened patiently, and then said that understanding the reason didn't make her feel any less alone. I respected that. I still do. What I did not respect was what came afterward. The phone calls to mutual friends. The slow rewriting of our marriage into a story where I was the villain and she was the woman who had suffered quietly for years. The way she described me to people as cold, detached, unfeeling. The way she said it at my daughter's wedding rehearsal dinner, loud enough for me to hear from across the room, a glass of wine loosening what should have stayed inside. Your father was always better at reading strangers than taking care of his own family. My daughter heard it too. I could tell by the way she went still for half a second before she turned back to her conversation. I didn't say anything that night. I ate my dinner, shook hands with my son-in-law's parents, drove back to my hotel, and sat by the window for a while in the dark. That was 3 years before she sent the signal. In those 3 years, here's what I did. I retired, with 26 years of service and a pension that covered my needs without extravagance. I bought a small house outside Asheville, up in the hills, with a porch that looked west toward the mountains. I grew tomatoes. I fixed things that needed fixing. I went to the hardware store on Saturday mornings and talked to the man behind the counter about whatever he wanted to talk about. People in town knew me as quiet, polite. They knew I was a veteran, that much was obvious, but they didn't ask beyond that, and I didn't offer. My daughter called every Sunday. My son-in-law, whose name was Marcus, was a good man, earnest, hard-working, the kind of person who remembered what you'd said 2 conversations ago and asked about it. He sold commercial real estate in Charlotte and coached youth soccer on weekends and had always treated my daughter like she was worth taking care of. I had liked him immediately. Immediate liking of people was not something that happened to me often. My ex-wife had made a point, at their wedding, of telling several people that she was glad my daughter had found a man who was actually present. She said it in that particular way. She had not quite directed at me, but not quite not. I had been standing near enough to hear. I had smiled at the person next to me and excused myself to get a glass of water. What my ex-wife did not know, what almost no one in my post-retirement life knew, was the nature of the work I had done before I left the service. She knew I was in intelligence. She did not know the specific shape of it. She did not know about the 2 years I spent in a country I cannot name, running sources under a cover identity that required me to become, convincingly and completely, someone other than myself. She did not know about the commendation I received in 2009, which sits in a box in my closet, because the citation is classified to a level that makes it unpresentable in polite company. She did not know that I had, on 4 separate occasions over the course of my career, talked someone out of doing something that would have resulted in a significant number of people being harmed. She knew I was a quiet man who liked order and wasn't very good at talking about feelings. She wasn't wrong about that part either. The signal my daughter sent me that night was something we had established the summer after her mother and I divorced. She had come to visit me in Fayetteville. I was still on base then, and we had sat on the back porch the way we used to when she was small, and she had said, carefully, "Dad, I need to ask you something." I said she could ask me anything. She said, "If something ever went wrong, if I was ever somewhere and couldn't just call and say help, is there a way I could let you know?" I had looked at her for a moment. I thought about why she was asking. I thought about Marcus, who I had only met twice at that point, and whether there was a reason she was asking that had a specific face on it. I asked her gently if there was something I needed to know. She said no. She said she just wanted the option. She said it made her feel safer knowing it existed. We created a simple system, a specific phrase, ordinary sounding, sent as a text. If I received it, I was to come, not call, not text back, not ask questions. Come, quietly. Know that the situation required discretion and possibly more than a phone call could solve. In 5 years, she had never used it, until that night outside of Asheville. I parked 2 houses down, the way I used to park when I didn't know what I was arriving into. I walked the perimeter of the property before I went to the door, not dramatically, not like someone in a film, just a quiet circuit of the yard that told me what I needed to know. 1 car in the driveway that wasn't Marcus's, lights on in the kitchen, and 1 upstairs bedroom. Back door locked, but the latch on the gate to the side yard had been forced recently. The metal was bent in a way it wouldn't bend from regular use. Someone had come through the side yard. I went to the front door. Marcus opened it. My daughter was at the kitchen table, and sitting in the living room, attempting to look comfortable and failing, was a man I didn't recognize, 40-something, thinning hair, the kind of restless energy in his body that came from either stimulants or fear or both. "Who's this?" the man said, looking at me with that particular brand of bravado men use when they're not sure how threatened to be. "My father," my daughter said. Her voice was very even. I looked at the man for a moment without speaking. I've found over the years that silence, applied correctly, tells you more about a person than most questions do. This man filled the silence immediately, shifted in his seat, looked at Marcus, looked back at me, tried a different expression and abandoned it. "We're just talking," he said. "All right," I said. I sat down in the armchair across from him. I did not take off my jacket. I did not make any sudden movements or aggressive gestures. I folded my hands and looked at him with the same attention I used to give to people in very different rooms, in very different circumstances, and I waited. His name, it turned out, was Derek. He had grown up with Marcus. They had been close once, years ago, before a business arrangement between them had gone complicated in ways that Derek now felt justified revisiting. What he had done was come to the house unannounced, after dark, through the side yard gate. What he had said to my daughter before Marcus got home was something she didn't repeat in full, but the shape of it was clear enough. He had wanted her to persuade Marcus to do something that Marcus had already said no to. He had wanted her to feel like she didn't have the option of saying no on Marcus's behalf. That was why she had sent me the signal. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened next, because it was not dramatic in the way stories are sometimes expected to be. No one was threatened openly. No voices were raised past a certain volume. Marcus came and sat near his wife. I sat across from Derek and we talked, the four of us, for a little over an hour. But I want to describe the quality of that conversation. There is a skill that takes years to develop. I spent most of my career refining it, which is the ability to make someone understand, without saying it directly, that their options are narrower than they believed when they walked in the room. It doesn't require aggression. It doesn't require anything that would make a recording of the conversation sound threatening. It requires precision. It requires knowing what the other person wants, and gently, methodically, removing their belief that they're going to get it. It requires them leaving the room feeling like they made a choice freely, when in fact the conversation had been guiding them toward the exit from the first sentence. I am very good at this. Derek left at 10:17. He shook Marcus's hand awkwardly and did not look at me directly when he said goodbye. He did not come back. After the door closed, my daughter sat at the kitchen table and cried for a few minutes. Not because she was broken, because she had been holding her breath for 3 hours, and now she could let it out. Marcus put his arm around her and looked at me over her head with an expression that I recognized as something between gratitude and a question he wasn't sure how to ask. I went to the kitchen and made coffee because it gave everyone somewhere to put their hands. When my daughter had stopped crying and wrapped both hands back around her mug, she looked at me and said, "I didn't tell you everything about what he said when he came in." I said she didn't have to. She said, "He told me that Marcus had mentioned you were around and that you were just some retired army guy. He said he actually said he won't be a problem." I poured my coffee. I didn't say anything. Marcus made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else. My daughter looked at me for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes, that specific shade of gray that goes darker when something is being figured out. She said, "What exactly did you do, Dad? In the army? For all those years?" I sat down across from her with my coffee cup. "And for the first time in a long time," I told her, "not everything. Some of it stays where it belongs, sealed behind clearance levels and the particular obligation of people who are trusted with things that can't be unsaid. But enough. The broad shape of it, the nature of the work, the patience required, the ability to read what's underneath what's being said, the way 26 years of that kind of attention leaves a mark on how you move through a room." She listened without interrupting. That was something I had always appreciated about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Marcus refilled everyone's coffee without being asked, which I thought well of him for. Then she said, "Mom used to say you were cold." "I know," I said. She was wrong about that. I thought about how to answer. I said, "She wasn't wrong about all of it. I was not easy to be married to. Some of what I am is genuinely difficult. The work shaped me in ways that made ordinary life harder than it should have been." I paused. "But cold isn't the right word. No." My daughter nodded slowly. She said, "You drove 45 minutes without calling, without knowing what you were coming into." "Yes." "Because I sent 7 words." "Yes." She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she said, simply, "Thank you." There's something I've thought about since that night. Driving home on the empty highway at midnight, the mountains dark on both sides. It's about the word invisible. My ex-wife used it once, in a conversation we had during the separation, when she was trying to explain how she'd felt. She said I had a gift for becoming invisible in social situations, for being in a room without taking up space in a way that people noticed. She meant it as a criticism. She meant it to say that I had never fully shown up, not in the way she needed. She was right that I had the skill. She was wrong about what it meant. The ability to be invisible in a room is not indifference to the room. It's the opposite. You have to pay very close attention to know where not to be seen. You have to understand the architecture of the space, who is watching what, where the attention collects, what the paths of least observation are. You cannot be a ghost in a room without first knowing the room completely. I had never been absent. I had been present in ways that didn't announce themselves. That distinction might sound like a rationalization. I've sat with it long enough to know it's also true. There is something I want to say to the men reading this, the ones who are quiet, the ones whose families sometimes look at them and see absence where there is actually a different kind of presence. The ones who were told at some point by someone they loved that their silence was a form of neglect. I'm not saying those criticisms are always wrong. Sometimes silence is avoidance. Sometimes distance is fear, wearing a more dignified costume. I've been guilty of both. But I am saying, don't let someone else's narrative about you go unchallenged forever. You are allowed to tell your own story. You are allowed to be the complicated thing you actually are rather than the simpler thing that's easier to explain to a room full of people at a dinner party. I am 63 years old. I grew tomatoes this year for the first time that actually came in big, heavy ones that sat on my kitchen counter and smelled the way tomatoes are supposed to smell. My daughter came up to visit in August with Marcus, and they sat on my porch and we watched the sun go down over the hills, and nobody needed to fill every moment with words. She calls every Sunday, same as always. Last month she asked me, out of nowhere in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, whether I had ever been afraid. In all those years, all those rooms, all those situations that I've described only partially even to her, I thought about the honest answer to that question for longer than she probably expected. Then I said, the only time I was actually afraid was when I got your text. Those 45 minutes on the highway. She didn't say anything right away. I said, the other stuff, I was trained for the other stuff. There's no training for your kid using the signal. She was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment. Then she said, well, you showed up. Yes, I told her. That part, I was always going to get right. There's a kind of man you pass every day without noticing. He's the one at the end of the bar who isn't watching the game but could tell you every person in the room by their posture. He's the one at the community meeting who hasn't spoken yet but has tracked every word. He's your neighbor who says little and fixes things without being asked, and whose past is a closed door that never seems important enough to knock on. He has probably spent a significant portion of his life being mistaken for something simpler than he is. That's all right. He knows what he is. And the people who matter, the ones he drove 45 minutes for in the dark without hesitating, they know too. That's enough. That has always been enough. The quietest people in the room are often carrying the most. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they learned long ago that presence doesn't require noise. If someone you love seems distant, consider that they may simply love differently through showing up at midnight, through driving without asking questions, through building a signal system, just so you'd never have to face something alone. Showing up, even once, can say everything words never could. A small note. This story was crafted and imagined by AI, created to entertain, and to carry a little warmth worth keeping.